Hello, this is Aina from Taproot Tarot. I recently got Nova Mundi's beautiful second edition of her Bacchus Tarot, which is a hand-painted remake of the Vandenborre Tarot. My copy is by US Games. It's a vintage deck from 1983. This can be referred to as the Flemish Tarot, the Bacchus Tarot, which would both refer to any of the Rouen-Brussels pattern, which this is a part of, or the Vandenborre Tarot, which is the printer of this particular deck. This is the latest and most detailed example of a Rouen-Brussels tarot that we have. But predictably, I couldn't just keep it as a simple comparative walkthrough with those two decks, and I wanted to take the opportunity to talk tarot history a little bit, and how we got the Rouen-Brussels pattern and how that relates to the TDM pattern. So we know that tarot or tarocchi developed in Italy in the 1400s by adding a fifth triumphal suit to a four-suited deck of playing cards. The images for that fifth suit were borrowed from various sources that were already in existence and well known to the Italians of that time period. I once saw a great comment in the tarot history group on Facebook that was something like, the tarot represents the popular culture or the pop culture of the time. And that's so very true, and it's going to ring especially true as we go through these Vandenborre decks. Now, because these images were well known and popular, their ranking was obvious, and early Italian tarots were not numbered in the triumphal suit. Now, those rankings might vary regionally, but overall, the people knew what the images were, they knew which card trumped which card, so they could play the game without the number rankings being printed on the deck. Once the game started to spread across Europe, though, people who weren't as familiar with these images benefited from numbering on those cards in order to be able to play the game effectively. And so that numbering kind of led to a standardization of the patterns that we see now. Different traditions developed in different parts of Italy. For example, the Milanese style is the one that made its way eventually to France and developed into the TDM pattern. These images were present in Italy, but they became standardized both by the numbering that was present in France, as well as the extensive printing press capabilities and the fact that the city of Marseille was a port town. All of those factors combined led to the Tarot de Marseille as becoming kind of the default historical tarot deck, the most widely spread and popular. Of course, for the purpose of gameplay and probably also cartomancy in the 15 and 1600s. And it wasn't until the late 1700s when esoteric stories were layered on top of those cards. And that happened actually a few decades after the TDM fell out of favor as a card game and was replaced by Jeu de Tarot, which had French pips. So in that case, where did the Rouen-Brussels pattern come from? Well, the images that evolved into the TDM originated in Milan, whereas another style developed in Florence and made its way through Ferrara and eventually to the Flanders region of the Austrian Netherlands of the time. Now, forgive me, I'm not a history expert or a geopolitical historian of any kind, and I'm speaking off the top of my head, I don't use notes, but my understanding is that Spain was trying to take over a bunch of European countries throughout the 1600s, and throughout the 1700s, the Austrian Empire and the Habsburgs were fighting with Spain for the region now known as Belgium, and during the 1700s known as the Austrian Netherlands. So this is where the Flemish tarot or the Rouen-Brussels pattern developed. This area, of course, is on the French border and is a French-speaking area, and we see one of the earlier, what is kind of considered a precursor of the Rouen-Brussels pattern in Paris, and that's the Jacques Viéville tarot. And that one, this copy of it is a facsimile from Vieux. And it is a blend of TDM and Rouen-Brussels pattern. Some people consider it to be an evolution from TDM to Viéville to Rouen-Brussels. That's probably not at all true. And those two patterns actually developed from two completely different parts of Italy and then merged together in the Viéville. Now, we can only date the cards that we have in existence, which is just a small fraction of the cards that existed at the time. And we can't necessarily date the wood blocks or the art that was made into the cards. So dating and, creating a timeline is very difficult when it comes to tarot history. But what most likely happened is that we had two styles of tarocchi, one from Milan, one from Florence and Ferrara, migrating their way through Europe toward France. One of them making it all the way to France and evolving into the TDM, and another making it to the Flanders region and developing into the Rouen-Brussels pattern. Those places being fairly close together and influencing each other, we get a blend called the Viéville. And it's probable that it's actually more complicated than that, and that these two influenced each other back and forth, and we have some evidence for that. So these two decks, the Noblet and the Jacques Viéville, were both created in the mid-1600s in the same neighborhood, and because of that, they have the same backing. A third deck that was created in the same neighborhood of Paris, and possibly around the same time, probably with very much older wood blocks, but the cards themselves were possibly created in the early to mid-1600s, was the Tarot of Paris. And that also has the same backing. And here we see the TdP juggler, which is quite a lot different from either of these two patterns. And that piece of information is going to be relevant later, so keep that in mind. Now, all of that is to lead me to an explanation as to why I don't consider the Rouen-Brussels an example of a TDM or a Tarot de Marseille, because it comes from a completely different style and tradition and a completely different area of Italy. So I'm not a TDM purist. Patterns that did definitely evolve from the TDM, like the Soprafino and the Swiss patterns and other derivatives of the TDM, I think it's fair to refer to those as TDM. You read them very much in a similar way as you read a TDM, even if it's not strictly an example of a Tarot de Marseille pattern. The Rouen-Brussels decks, however, are different enough that not only do they have different origins, but the deck itself is different enough from the TDM that you really do have to alter the way you read cards in order to read it. So I thought it would be a fun comparison to include not just these two lovely examples of the Vandenborre tarot, but also the Viéville and a TDM, in which case I chose the Noblet just because of its proximity to both the Viéville and the Tarot of Paris, which are both relevant to the Rouen-Brussels pattern. These are ordered in the order in which I received the Vandenborre, which was also the order of Novo Mundi's deck, which we'll see includes the Fool at the end of the Triumphs labeled 22. And you've probably noticed a lot of similarities between all four of these, but the TDM is facing a different direction and has kind of more simplified implements on his table. This is a juggler, a street performer. The Noblet famously has a broken wood block so that his slapstick is missing, as well as some of his fingers. And I've mentioned before that this was originally not a wand, but a slapstick used to distract audience members as the juggler hid his juggling balls, under the cups, or card tricks, things like that. Just a way to engage in some trickery. I really love the Rouen-Brussels table of goodies, which includes a deck of cards. It looks like there's a candle snuff, some dice, all sorts of goodies. And here are the lovely backs, which are Suns, Novas, and the US games. That leads us to key number 2, which in the TDM and Jacques Viéville is the Pépès, and in the Vandenborre is the Spanish captain, known as Fracasse. You probably noticed this is also referred to as a Bacchus deck, so we'll get to Bacchus later, but that was an intentional play on words at the time to be able to call this the Bacus and Fracasse deck. So we have a number of decks that replace the Pope and Pépès. In the case of the decks that developed in and around France, those replacements were not likely made in order to avoid offending the Pope or Catholics. In fact, the Pope and Pépès cards were very popular and used frequently in Catholic areas of France. But in those more Protestant areas that led into, Belgium and Switzerland, all those areas were more Protestant and people didn't want to use cards that had the Pope and Pépès on them, so they would replace them. In the case of the Besançon decks, they replaced them with Jupiter and Juno, and in this case, they replaced them with Bacus and Fracasse, Remember, I mentioned before that at this time that the Rouen-Brussels pattern is developing, Spain is losing its control over the Austrian Netherlands. And this character, who comes from Commedia dell'arte, a theater style that developed in Italy but spread throughout Europe and even led to the Punch and Judy shows in Britain, Fracas started out as an Italian captain, and as Spain weakened as a colonial power, became known as the Spanish captain. Commedia dell'arte was performed largely improvised, but each character had bits that actors could fall back on if they didn't know what else to do. And one of the Spanish captain's bits is that somebody would be describing a beautiful lady to him, and the dagger hanging from his belt would raise up in a provocative manner. And this visual pun is referenced in the Spanish captain card here, as we can see. So this character was kind of a rowdy fellow. He would brag about his military conquests, about his success with women. He would dress in very fine clothing, but underneath he was actually a coward and not very good with money. So he had an outward appearance that said one thing and an internal reality that said something different, which, you know, if you relate to the legend of Pope Joan, could certainly be a parallel across these cards. Nova does have some information cards with her deck, and she does offer some possible interpretations for the Spanish captain and Bacchus. But another parallel that I tend to draw between the Papess and Fracas is, thanks to Paul Hewson and Claire Burgess, who made the game Marseille, I like to see the Papess as kind of a revolutionary, somebody who's standing up to the system and doing things her own way. And when you read the TDM with divisions by 10, the Papess relates to the Hanged Man, and so you can kind of see how they both could be people who are bucking the system, one of which is being punished for that by being hung upside down. But Hewson relates this card to Sister Manfreda, who was appointed Papess of a heretical Catholic sect called the Guillamites, I think. And she was an ancestor of the Viscontis, who commissioned the earliest tarot cards that we have in existence. So it is possible that she is who was portrayed on the Papess card. Now, she was executed as a heretic, but we also see the Spanish captain as somebody who maybe wasn't doing it for the right reasons, but was certainly bucking the system, rebelling against the rules and the laws, and generally just engaging in disorderly conduct by getting into fights and just being a bombastic and rowdy individual. So you could see some parallels there too, but I want to read to you from the book that came from the US Games version. This is a pretty great book, really, and one of my favorite parts of it is this paragraph here. It says, "The interpretation of the Flemish tarot does not call for any artifices. To consult and understand the cards, it is sufficient to refer to the symbolism of the pictures as originally conceived." Amen. I think that's a great way of looking at the tarot in general. And the meaning, which is suggested here for the Spanish captain. This card symbolizes daring, boldness, and courage. It contains a good dose of dynamism and power, but for all the energy it promises, it also contains the risk of overestimating yourself, so be careful. That's pretty great. And the Empress cards, and we'll see a lot of these are simply reversed in these three examples from the TDM. Although interestingly, the lovely bold colors are similar between the Noble and the Vandenborre. These are similar to the original colors of the Vandenborre, but they're a little different, and I will post a link to the British Museum pictures for you because the original is really beautiful. And then we have Nova Mundi's gorgeous interpretation. The colors of her deck are just fantastic. Emperor. I love the green beard and the lips. So good. And the Pope along with Bacchus. On both of these, the Noble and the Viéville, we see a type 1 Pope with a pastoral staff instead of the double cross. And in general, in Pope cards, he's holding his hand as a way to bestow a blessing. Absolutely love this Viéville Pope. His face is lovely. But do you see how he's offering a blessing with that hand gesture? So you could see Bacchus as offering up a blessing in the form of a keg of wine as well. In her information card, Nova Mundi notes, Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, ecstasy, and revelry, replaces the traditional Pope card in this deck. It represents excess, indulgence, and worldly pleasure. It warns against overindulgence, urging moderation, awareness of desires, and grounding joy into sustainable, meaningful living. That's lovely. And let's see what the US Games interpretation is. It notes that Bacchus is the god of wine, fertility, and revelry. Bacchus is a favorable card. It promises success, rewards, and peace. All these benefits are assured and you can enjoy them fully. But you also run the risk of weakening your own efforts. When surrounded by unfavorable cards, it is precisely your weaknesses in the struggle of life that are brought out by Bacchus, since it is very possible that you will want to enjoy these blessings without having earned them. Lovely woven wine casket and a simplified spelling of Bacchus. Here we see the blindfolded TDM Type 1 Cupid. And a slightly different style here, which is unique and also different from the TDM Type 2. Nova's color choices are just magnificent. Here, labeled as, I think, the Lover's card, plural, and here labeled simply as love, I think. I don't speak French though. And here is the TDM Type 1 Chariot with the scalloped awning. And similar here, but one of the earliest depictions of the Chariot card where the horses have human faces. And here, a completely different depiction of the Chariot, which comes more from the Florentine or Ferrarese styles. A lot of the horses in these patterns have pretty feathers on their heads. Justice. Here, the hermit is depicted as a monk reading a book, and in the Viéville, he looks very similar, but it's unclear what he is supposed to be holding. He seems to just be holding up his cloak, but perhaps at some point he was intended to be holding another object, which was lost in time. Whereas we have a more typical hermit with a lantern facing the other direction in the TDM Type 1. I was reading the Tarot Heritage site to brush up on info about the Rouen-Brussels pattern. And as they were describing the origins in the Florentine and Ferrarese style, the deck that they brought up was the Estensi Tarot, which here is a version called the Golden Tarot of the Renaissance. Only 16 cards of this deck remain, and it is not a popular mass-printed deck. We don't have very many of those in existence that are very old. A lot of times these more high-end commissioned art pieces are the ones that survive from the older tarot history, which doesn't mean that there weren't popular mass-printed decks. And I'm pretty convinced that tarot developed as a game of the people and was adopted in fancier forms by the nobility from the card games of the people. But this was a hand-painted commissioned deck in Ferrara, and this deck is pretty cool by Lo Scarabeo. The missing cards, including illustrated pips, are images of frescoes from a Ferrarese castle. So while it doesn't really align with tarot history, it does align with the art history of the time. So it's pretty neat. There are better examples of this pattern, from the popular mass-produced world of decks, but since that article mentioned this deck in particular, I have some examples of these cards, and one of them is Father Time rather than a Hermit. Now, keeping in mind that this wouldn't have been labeled or numbered, as was the tradition of Tarot decks of the time. So in my view, there's a lot more similarity between this Ferreira pattern and the Rouen-Brussels than there is with the TDM pattern. And I think that's interesting. Look at his purple eyes. Love it. As with the other cards, the wheel is turning a different direction in the TDM compared to the other three. And this creature, a donkey, on the left going up, so you can see here in the Viéville, is a little harder to see in the Vandenborre. But if you compare this with the TDM, you can kind of see how that's supposed to be a donkey, but got a little bit changed in translation. And so once we get fully to the Vandenborre, it's really just kind of a nondescript entity with an eye, which I think is pretty funny and cool. For this second edition, Nova Mundi did make some changes and updates in her coloration, especially making some changes in the pips. So I will link the video where she talks about this and talks about how she updated the coloring. Her deck is available both on Game Crafters and Make Playing Cards. On Make Playing Cards, there are a few different versions. Mine is the Game Crafters edition. You can really see the similarities here between these two as compared to the TDM. And the gorgeous update by Nova Mundi. In the Noble, you can see the Type 1 pattern of the Hanged Man, with his hands visible behind his back, also a very alarmed look on his face. And something similar with the Viéville, not quite so alarmed in appearance, and the direction is shifted. But what you also see is that the number is either backwards and on the bottom, or likely he was mistakenly printed upside down with the number on top. And I'm not sure if this is the case with this particular deck, but one thing that would happen is in order for deck makers to pay their proper taxes, in some cases they would actually have to bring all of their wood blocks and paper and ink to a government sanctioned printing facility, and those printers would print it for them in order to get the tax stamp. Which I can't even imagine if you're an artisan and you go to all the trouble and work of creating your product, but then you have to hand it over to somebody else to do the actual printing. And in cases like that, it would be very possible that they didn't know that this shouldn't have been upside down. So in all likelihood, with the Viéville or decks related to it at the time, this was a mistake that was just adopted by the later Rouen-Brussels pattern. And you'll see with the Viéville, it's not even labeled, but they kind of solidified that aspect of the pattern by going ahead and labeling it. They just went with it. So for my Viéville, I keep him upside down. Traditionally, people put the Rouen-Brussels card right side up or upside down, however you want to look at that. Now, some people consider it to be a replacement for the missing fourth cardinal virtue, which is prudence. So we have the other three cardinal virtues: fortitude, known as strength, temperance, and justice. And there are really good reasons for that those three would traditionally be included without prudence. Prudence was considered something separate in many cases. But some people wanted to replace the prudence card or consider something else as prudence, and she was often depicted with a snake. So some people would decide to turn the hanged man upside down and consider this rope to be a snake instead. I don't think they actually believe that's what it was supposed to be, but I think that would become tradition simply to have a prudence card. Of course, the hermit was often sometimes seen as a replacement for prudence, and you'll even see in some later engraved decks that the hermit includes a snake. Death card, pretty similar across the board. In this Rouen-Brussels pattern, we see quite a deviation from the TDM Temperance card. And this says Fama Sol, which likely means only fame, and is interestingly backwards in the Viéville. Now, we talked about how the fifth triumphal suit was added as images borrowed from other sources, and therefore a representation of the popular culture of the time. So we see influences from the morality plays, the play cycles of the time, influences from didactic imagery, which include the cardinal virtues, for example, such as temperance. And we also see influence from Petrarch's Triomphi, which is where we get the name triumphs or trumps for that suit. And so it was Petrarch, we have to thank, maybe not only for the Renaissance happening at all, but also for the word trump, which was shortened from triumphs as a gaming term. So in Petrarch's poem, Triomphi, he notes that only fame defeats death. In other words, if you live on in fame, then you outlive death. And that is a reference to the fact that temperance at 14 trumps the death card at 13. The cardinal virtue of temperance in the early Renaissance wouldn't have referred to temperance in the sense of abstaining from alcohol and overeating. There was actually a different virtue that covered that. This one would have more to do with controlling one's emotions. But this is a later pattern, and we see here that she's holding something that kind of looks like a caduceus. So it could be a reference to being temperate in the way you take care of your body or your health, which would have been a later concept around the time that these cards were, or this pattern was developed, which we see in the Viéville as well. I love that version of it. But I'm not positive that's what that represents, so if you have thoughts, do let me know. And we have a super cool devil that evolved from this pattern. The presence of eyes and faces all over his body would have been intended to elicit fear, and is also probably a representation of the theatrical version of the devil, which would have just been dressed in some outrageous, scary costume like this, and would probably have also been a fire breather for theatrical effect. So again, these are often images taken from morality plays that were depicted at the time. Here, the type 1 devil does have a face on his abdomen, which represents a medieval concept of thinking with your lower mind, or thinking with your stomach, or your so-called lower impulses rather than with your head. So we see that stomach face here on this version of the devil as well. Super fun. And here's where things get really interesting. We have La Foudre, or the Thunderbolt, also known as the Lightning card. And here is La Maison Dieu, the House of God, as is traditional for the TDM pattern. Personally, I tend to refer to all of them as lightning, unless they don't depict lightning, which most of them do. And for me, the devil being very rooted in the earth, and then the later celestial cards coming after this, lightning in its process is actually a charge that comes down from above, but also up from the earth. So if you see slow motion video of lightning, you can see that it actually comes from both directions and meets in the middle. So this is kind of a bridge between the earthly and the celestial. But also a major oh shit moment here for this goat herd. Amongst farmers, it's pretty well known that you can lose your entire herd if they are taking shelter under a tree, which gets struck by lightning, because that charge can travel through the roots and into your animals, which is a horrible thing. And you can see in these earlier cards, they hadn't really figured out the shape of lightning that we recognize today wasn't really developed yet. So what they're depicting is more the way the clouds look when they're being lit up by lightning. And these balls dropping from the sky, which are interpreted in all sorts of interesting esoteric ways, were probably actually just a depiction of flashes of light. It's a very simplified art form, so they had to come up with simplified ways of depicting these kind of difficult visual phenomena. And here, since Vandenborre is a later deck of cards, we see a more recognizable lightning pattern. Poor goats, be safe, little friends. So as I mentioned in that Tarot Heritage article I read, they were talking about the Estensi deck as one representative of the Fiorentine and Ferrarese styles, which in this case uses astronomers for the moon card. Now here we have an astronomer as the star card. So again, this wasn't necessarily a standardized pattern, but it was a tendency in this style to have an astronomer somewhere in there. And this is a particularly detailed one. Now the star card of the Estensi deck doesn't exist anymore, and the fresco that was borrowed to create it for the Lo Scarabeo deck is a woman in the ocean. What I know of this pattern, I would guess that the original star card was likely the three wise men. In the Minchiate, we sometimes see just one magus riding a horse, but in some of these other decks we see three wise men holding their treasures underneath the star. But here we have the astronomer under the star card in the Rouen-Brussels pattern. And similarly, we have someone holding a spindle under the sun card in the Estensi deck. And we see that under the moon card in the Viéville, as well as the Rouen-Brussels decks. In comparison to the Type 1 TDM moon card. And the baby on the horse, as opposed to the two children on the sun card of the TDM. Definitely more child-looking here in the Viéville, with a detailed horse's face. And here we're a little uncertain. Is this a child or not? The original, as pictured on the British Museum, the horse's face is a little more detailed, but we're definitely seeing some interesting like folk art style depictions there. I love this angry sun. In the original on the British Museum page, you can see a little bit more shading on the chin of this person riding the horse, which Nova has interpreted as a beard, which I think is delightful. So for folks who don't enjoy a baby on a horse in your sun card, this is awesome. I like it. Fairly similar judgment cards across the board with gorgeous colors in Nova Mundi's version. So as a recap, we decided it's probably likely that the Rouen-Brussels pattern developed in Austrian Netherlands, and perhaps a prototypical version of that made its way to Paris, where the Viéville was influenced both by that pattern and the TDM. And we see that difference here with the Christ in Majesty type image here, with what started out probably as a Christ-like figure with the four evangelists around him, and obviously developed into a more feminine world card later. But here we see a figure standing on top a globe, more similar to what we see in the Ferreira style deck. But what brings our story into question just a bit is the Tarot of Paris. So again, a little recap. The Noblet, the Viéville, were both being printed in the same neighborhood around the same time as the Tarot of Paris, which has this world card. Now, not only do we see that same figure in the middle, but we see this cartouche up at the top, which we see on no other decks. This is unique amongst decks that are still in existence to the Tarot of Paris. Where that cartouche came from is unclear, but it was definitely adopted in whole by the Rouen-Brussels pattern. Now, the Rouen-Brussels pattern has 3 decks now in existence, one from the early 1700s called Gérard Baudet. There's one called Hotot that comes a little bit later, Houtot. And then this one, the Vandenborre, is from the late 1700s. Now, in that earliest pattern, the Gérard Baudet, we see that it has the same kind of checkered background as the Tarot of Paris as well, which was simplified in the Vandenborre. So that's super interesting. And again, it's so difficult to date these cards while this was being printed right around the time of the Viéville, so this can't be a coincidence. These woodblocks were probably much older. The Viéville woodblocks may have been much older than the mid-1600s, so it leaves a lot of questions as to how this pattern developed. But I think that's super fascinating because it's such a unique image and we only see it here. And who is this? We're not sure. It could be the goddess Nyx, bringing the curtain of night over the world. And if you're interested in some serious tarot history dorking out, please check out my Tarot of Paris deep dive. I think it's called Super Deep Dive. I'll link it in the description because there is a part 2 coming. And it's not just about the Tarot of Paris, it's about tarot history in general. So however we came here, we ended up with this gorgeous world card with these lovely, probably lions. They look more like leonine in the Tarot of Paris. Oh, and if you are wondering about these faces down here, that seems to be a simplification of the 4 winds that we see pictured in the Tarot of Paris. Now, usually the Fool or Lamot is numberless because he's an exception. He doesn't trump any cards, but no cards really trump him either, so he can travel throughout that 5th suit, which has led to kind of the legend of the Fool traveling through the triumphs. And a lot of the stories we tell as we use cards for divination and the strategies actually do come from gameplay. So it is interesting to study the history of tarot as a game in order to understand why we use it for divination the way we do. So number 22 in this case, and unnumbered in these cases. And this is an interesting detail, whereas in the TDM we have his spoon and pack. Here we have a pack that is tied to a stick, but here his pack is tied to a jester's marat. So that is the little stick that has a head imitating his own head with the ass's ears, which we see in the Tarot of Paris with a jester's marat. So that's another interesting parallel to consider. And here's another difference. We see the typical castle or cathedral type chalice in the TDM and the Viéville, but more of a covered Swiss goblet in the Rouen-Brussels. We have our dolphins or serpents or dragons here, with part of a poem about the triumphs in the Viéville. But the 2 of Cups here, not only do we have a tulip with a couple of flowers, but we have instructions here which indicate that in order to play this game, the cups and coins go from largest number to smallest. So in other words, the Ace of Cups will trump the 10 of Cups, for example, and same with coins, but it's the other way around for the batons and swords. And interestingly, this guidebook takes that into account and lists the cups and coins in reverse order in the tarot meanings, which, by the way, are rather old school and really negative. Like, the swords in that book are all just terrible, but then you even get to like the cups and they're like more than half of them are awful. So it's pretty interesting. I think it kind of takes the philosophy of, you know, swords are bad, so the more swords there are, the worse it gets, and then the other way around for the other ones. But that's just an interesting variation of gameplay that developed in the Flemish region. So really beautiful floral traditions. That we see in the pips of the Vandenborre. That's just lovely. And I got off by a card somewhere. Oh, that was somehow I misordered that. One fun thing about the Viéville, which is also true of the Tarot of Paris, interestingly, is that we have some older valets with no labeling on the Viéville, but we do have labels in the other three. In the TDM, we tend to see that she's holding some kind of a sharp object, often depicted as a sword, which it does look like in the Convert facsimile anyway. In some areas, it looks more like a distaff, and you can even kind of see the string. And in the Suzanne Bernardin version, it definitely looks more like a distaff, which is interesting. But here it's more clearly depicted as a scepter. And onto batons. One unique variation here is that we start seeing Arabic numerals to help out with the counting, without having to take up space with the progressive Roman numerals. And by progressive Roman numerals, I mean that 4s are depicted as 4 eyes instead of an IV, which makes more sense for gameplay strategy, to have a more visual representation of the numbers in front of you. Now on the Viéville, you're on your own. There's no labeling. But earlier tarot decks were developed at a time when Europe was still kind of trying to figure out Arabic numerals, such as this 4, which we do see a little bit on the early Emperor cards, for example, in the TDM. There is an Arabic numeral 4. And that is one reason that it isn't traditional for TDM readers to use numerology, because you need to, in order to do that adding of 2 digits, that requires Arabic numerals, which just weren't really perfected in the TDM tradition. If you add these numerals together, you'll get the 4, because that's how Roman numerals work. So number associations are more in line with traditional gameplay and the use of progressive Roman numerals rather than Arabic numerals, which is why we don't do what is considered modern numerology, but more like divisions by 10 and things like that. Very fancy mustachioed valets here. And we see more of the fancy feathered horses in both the Viéville and Vandenborre. I do love the titties out Queen of Batons in the Noble. She just doesn't care. I love that for her. But this is a style, actually, a courtly style of the time where the bodice was made of gauze and was see-through, because she's the queen and she can do what she wants. But really lovely Queens of Batons here as well. So in the Ace of Coins has the rest of that poem about the triumphs in the Viéville. Here in the Ace of Coins of the Rouen-Brussels pattern, or specifically here in the Vandenborre, we see that it was made by the printer Vandenborre, the Cartier in Brussels. But it also says cards of Switzerland, which this US Games Little White Book does explain. It says during the 17th century, some card makers of Lyon in France emigrated to Switzerland in order to escape the heavy tax on the manufacture of playing cards. The tarots they started to produce there, however, were somewhat different from those of their homeland, and these packs began to be known as cartes de Suisse. When card makers in then Austrian Netherlands, presently Belgium, also began to produce tarot packs, they continued to call them cartes de Suisse. So that's the explanation there, and it's probably just another layer in, you know, how these different card styles influenced each other and later developed into the Rouen-Brussels pattern. So in all these cases, we have credit to the card makers. On the Two of Coins, we just have that done a little differently in this more ribbon style around the coins in the TDM and Viéville. Whereas the Rouen-Brussels has a distinct pattern, but does indicate that it was made by the Vandenborre printing press. Nova's colors in these pips are just amazing. So we have a little striped coat of arms here, a different one there, and a lion one there. I don't know where those all originate, but I'm sure somebody who knows about that kind of historical stuff could help place the timeline of these cards using those coats of arms. How gorgeous is that? Love it. Now the original of these in the British Museum pictures do include tax stamps, kind of like what we see here on the Noblet. But those have been edited out for the US Games version. I love how the Rouen-Brussels horses are so curly-haired and cute. The scepter much more similar between these two, whereas these two we have what I like to think of as like a chair leg style scepter, which we also saw in the Queen of Cups. So in both the TDM and the Viéville, we have this coronet with a branch of laurels as well as a palm frond. And that is the coat of arms for, I think it's the Sforzas, either the Viscontis or the Sforzas. I'm pretty sure the Sforzas. Whereas here it is developed into just a couple of palm fronds, which I think is just a simplification. And probably not a change in who it's supposed to represent. You might hear my dogs wrestling in the background. I tend to see this as a water bird, like a sandpiper or something, running along a shore with a rock in the background. Some people like to see that as an egg, but it looks like a shorebird to me, next to a cliff or a rock. Lots of really beautiful embellishments in the Rouen-Brussels pattern. With more swordy looking swords as well. Some branches of laurels there, I think. Really gorgeous. It reminds me, my mom used to do rose mauling, which is a really ornate Scandinavian form of painting. It reminds me a lot of that. I always like to think of the Valet of Swords as being very stylish and sharp, and I think that's represented really well both in the TDM, but very much in the Rouen-Brussels, and I think Nova's version really emphasizes that. Super fancy feathery horses, love them. And finally, the King of Swords. So this is the lovely second edition of the Bacchus Tarot by Nova Mundi from Game Crafters. On her MPC site, she also has versions on, different playing card stock and available even in a tin. I haven't broken this deck in yet. But I also have her Torino Tarot, which I have broken in. So I can tell you, once you give it a few shuffles, it shuffles really nice. Even without being broken in, it's still shuffling pretty well. It's a glossy cardstock. It's UV something. I'm not a cardstock expert, but it's quite nice. It has a papery feel on the sides, but nice and semi-gloss and very slidey. Well, that was fun. I hope you thought so too. I enjoyed going through a little bit of tarot history with you. You know me, I can't just do a boring walkthrough. I gotta dork out to some history with you as well. Oh, and I should mention too that Tarot Revive, a card maker that I've mentioned before, also has a version of the Vandenborre. But that US Games copy is pretty gettable. I didn't talk much about its cardstock, but it is quite papery. It's like art paper with no coating whatsoever on it. Just FYI. Alrighty, thank you so much for being here. I will talk to you next time. Bye.